The courtroom was deathly silent. The judge's gavel came down hard, delivering the verdict that shattered Jacob Harris's life. Guilty. A decorated officer with 15 years on the force. Jacob sat handcuffed, staring at the floor. Despite his repeated claims of innocence, the jury had ruled against him. The evidence, planted, he was certain, was enough to send him to prison. But the weight of the sentence wasn't what crushed him most. It was knowing he'd have to leave Max, his loyal K-9 partner, behind. Max sat near the back of the courtroom, his sharp gaze locked on Jacob. The German Shepherd had been more than a partner. He had been Jacob's constant companion through life-or-death moments. Now, as Jacob faced the lowest point of his life, the thought of never seeing Max again was unbearable. When the judge rose to leave, Jacob's voice broke through the tense silence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "before I'm taken away, I have one last request. Please, let me say goodbye to Max." The courtroom murmured in surprise. The judge stopped, studying Jacob for a long moment. Finally, he nodded, his voice firm but sympathetic. 3 minutes. As soon as Max was released, the dog sprinted toward Jacob, his claws clicking loudly on the floor. Jacob dropped to his knees, pulling Max into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Jacob whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I let you down. I won't be there anymore." Max whimpered, nuzzling into Jacob's chest. But then something changed. Max's body tensed, and his nose began to work frantically against Jacob's jacket. He tugged at the fabric, barking sharply. The sudden sound broke the solemn stillness of the courtroom, drawing every eye. "What's the dog doing?" the judge asked, frowning. Max pulled harder, his sharp barks echoing off the walls. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously and began to check Jacob's jacket. The tension in the room became suffocating. Then, with a metallic clink, a small object fell to the floor. It was a recording device. The prosecutor's face went pale. He stepped forward quickly, his voice shaky. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped, trying to regain control of the moment. But Max barked again, his alert stance unyielding. The truth was clear. Whatever was on that device mattered. Jacob stared at the small recorder, his heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Could this be the proof he'd been waiting for? The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. The small recording device lay in the center of the floor, its metallic casing glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Max remained rigid beside Jacob, his piercing barks cutting through the room as if demanding someone pay attention. Every set of eyes turned to the object, and the air became thick with tension. "Pick it up," the judge ordered, his voice low but firm. The officer closest to the device hesitated for a moment before bending down and scooping it into his hand. He held it up for all to see. Confusion etched across his face. "What is this?" the judge asked sharply, directing his gaze toward the prosecutor, who was already beginning to sweat. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his face pale. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. It's not part of the evidence submitted during the trial," he stammered. "Clearly, it's been tampered with." "Tampered with?" the judge interrupted, his eyebrows knitting together. "In a courtroom? During sentencing?" His voice carried a razor-sharp edge now, and the prosecutor visibly flinched. "Officer, activate the device." The officer fumbled with the small recorder, his fingers trembling as he pressed the play button. A static-filled crackle filled the room, followed by muffled voices. Everyone leaned forward, straining to listen, and then the words hit like a bombshell. "Just plant the evidence," a gruff voice said. "Clear as day. No one's going to question it. Harris's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Get it done." Gasps erupted across the room. Jacob's heart stopped, then began pounding furiously. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone he had trusted, his former supervisor, Captain Greg Wallace. "That's enough," the prosecutor blurted, rushing toward the officer holding the recorder. But the judge slammed his gavel down. "Sit down," he barked, his tone so commanding that the prosecutor froze mid-step. Jacob couldn't believe what he was hearing. The damning recording revealed everything: how the evidence had been planted, how he had been framed, Max, still sitting calmly at Jacob's side, let out a single low growl, as if echoing his partner's silent fury. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. "This trial is not over," he said firmly, addressing the room. "Bailiffs, escort the defendant back to holding. Officers, secure that device as new evidence. We're reopening this case." For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt a spark of hope as he was led away. Max watched him go, his intelligent eyes filled with unshakable loyalty. Jacob turned back for one last look at his partner, silently promising himself and Max that he wouldn't let this injustice stand. Back in the cold holding cell, Jacob sat on the hard bench, staring at the blank concrete wall. His mind raced with everything that had just happened. Max's sharp instincts had uncovered what no one else had: proof of a setup. That recording was his lifeline. But the revelation wasn't just a relief. It was a betrayal. Captain Greg Wallace, the man who had mentored him for years, was behind it. Jacob clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. How deep did this go? Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, tension ran high. The judge sat at his desk, replaying the recording on a secure device. The voices were unmistakable. Captain Wallace's commanding tone, paired with another voice Jacob didn't recognize, revealed a calculated conspiracy. The judge's eyes narrowed. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Summon Captain Wallace to my office immediately," he said curtly. Outside the courtroom, Wallace had been waiting to ensure Jacob's sentencing went smoothly, at least for his plan. But when the bailiffs approached him with the judge's sudden summons, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He rose stiffly, adjusting his tie, and followed the officers down the hall. Inside the chambers, the judge's expression was unreadable as Wallace entered. The captain offered a polite nod, but his shoulders were tense. "You called for me, Your Honor?" Wallace asked, his voice steady, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the recording device on the desk. "I did," the judge replied, leaning forward. He tapped the recorder with his finger. "Care to explain this?" Wallace's facade of confidence faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor," he said evenly. The judge pressed play. Once again, the damning words filled the room. Wallace's face drained of color, but he recovered quickly. "Your Honor, this is absurd," Wallace said, forcing a chuckle. "That could be anyone. You can't seriously think—" "I don't think," the judge interrupted, his voice hard. "I act on evidence. And this," he gestured to the recorder, "is evidence of a crime. Multiple crimes. In fact." "Bailiffs," the judge called, and before Wallace could respond, two officers entered the room. Panic flashed in Wallace's eyes as they approached him. "What are you doing?" Wallace demanded, his voice rising. "You can't. You're being detained for questioning," the judge said firmly, "until we get to the bottom of this. You're a suspect in obstruction of justice and falsifying evidence." As the bailiffs led a protesting Wallace away, the judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The web of corruption was unraveling fast, and Jacob Harris's story was far from over.